Hi, it's Katrina.
Elasmosaur. The Elasmosaur was a marine monster you would not have wanted to meet face to face. The skeleton of one of these beasts was recently discovered on Vancouver Island. Pat Trask, a tour operator who specializes in fossil hunting, was with a group when one of the visitors picked up something they thought might be a fossil. It turned out to be the finger bone of one of the most dangerous and terrifying creatures that ever roamed the seas. It was the finger bone of an Elasmosaur, an aquatic reptile that lived alongside dinosaurs. Just a few months later, another guest on the tour picked up a small bone about the size of a hockey puck. This bone was later identified as coming from the wrist of the Elasmosaur. It was about this time that Pat realized there was probably an entire skeleton waiting to be uncovered. Since then, Pat has found stomach stones, a humerus bone, and several other small fossils. The Elasmosaur lived 80 million years ago. Although they were terrifying monsters of the deep, they were also exceptionally strange. The creature had a body similar to a turtle, except huge. It also had a long neck like the Loch Ness Monster and a mouthful of pointy teeth like sharp needles. Then there were its flippers, which it used to paddle through the water, and its short tail for balance and speed. Other fossils of the Elasmosaur have been found in Texas, Kansas, and Alberta. Acrocanthosaurus. The Acrocanthosaurus was a gigantic and terrifying predator on par with more familiar dinosaurs like the Tyrannosaurus rex. And yet the fact that it once existed only recently became known to the public. Its name translates to high-spined lizard, and it was a truly massive beast. The Acrocanthosaurus has the title of the fourth biggest carnivore during the Mesozoic era at a whopping 35 feet long and weighing 6 tons. The only real reason nobody knows this dinosaur's name is because it's too long and too complicated. It doesn't quite roll off the tongue like T-Rex. What made the Acrocanthosaurus unique from other predators of its time were the neural spines branching from its neck and spine, supporting some kind of hump. Imagine your own spine with foot-long chunks sticking straight out to support a ridge along your entire body, like the sail on a Spinosaurus. It's so bizarre that researchers don't even know what exactly this monster looked like, if it was a hunchback dinosaur, or if it had a sail on its back. The one thing that's for sure is that the Acrocanthosaurus had an excellent sense of smell. Researchers have been able to create a detailed map of the dinosaur's brain, which for some reason was shaped like an S. It had a very unusual brain with huge olfactory lobes that suggest an unprecedented sense of smell. The Acrocanthosaurus once lived all throughout the state of Texas. From the southwest to the northeast, researchers have found dozens upon dozens of Acrocanthosaurus footprints. It's believed these ferocious predators, even being nearly 40 feet long, operated in packs to hunt gigantic sauropod herds. Pulmonoscorpius. The Pulmonoscorpius is an extinct species of scorpion that lived during the Carboniferous period, about 359 million years ago. Its fossils were discovered in Scotland of all places, and it was a truly terrifying prehistoric creature. This scorpion could have grown to an estimated 3 feet or more in length. Superficially, it was almost identical to modern scorpions. It had pincer claws for pinching, skinny legs for scuttling through the dirt, and a gigantic tail with a stinger on the end for murdering its prey. The only real difference between scorpions of today and scorpions of 300 million years ago is the size. The Pulmonoscorpius was roughly the size of a human toddler or a large dog. As terrifying as a giant scorpion is to think about, the evolution of the creature does make sense. Researchers believe the Pulmonoscorpius and other creatures like it grew to such preposterously huge sizes because of the oxygen content in the atmosphere. There was about 35% pure oxygen in the atmosphere during the Carboniferous, as opposed to the 20% in our atmosphere now. All of that oxygen helped even the tiniest of insects grow into unstoppable monsters. As for how venomous the Pulmonoscorpius was, no one really knows. As a general rule, the bigger the scorpion, the weaker the venom. If that's the case, it likely used its venom only to subdue its victims, and then it dissected them with its massive pinchers. SerpentaSukups. A new prehistoric sea monster was recently found in Wyoming. A team from the College of Charleston found and named a beast that swam the seas 70 million years ago. This was at the same time the dinosaurs walked the earth. The new monster is called the SerpentaSukups, or something like that, and it was like the real-life version of the Loch Ness Monster. Its name translates to snaky crocodile face. Maybe someone from the team can help with the pronunciation, but in the meantime, I'm just going with it. The SerpentaSukups had a long serpentine neck, jaws not unlike those of a massive crocodile, and a fat body. It belonged to a group of creatures known as plesiosaurs, which had large bodies and long, broad flippers for sailing quickly through the water. By far, the most unique feature of this scary new species is its neck. It was like an underwater giraffe. To put things into perspective, a giraffe's neck has only 7 vertebrae, even though its neck can grow 8 feet long and weigh nearly 600 pounds. This plesiosaur had 32 vertebrae in its neck. There's a possibility its neck was almost 23 feet long, weighing multiple tons. And at the end of that unbelievably long neck was the head of a crocodile and the brain of a super predator. Utah Raptor. Grand County in Utah is home to about 9,600 people. It's a small community that also happens to be home to a large and terrifying extinct predator. It's here in Grand County where the only fossils of the Utah raptor have ever been found. The Utah raptor was about the size of a bear. It had claws that could shred muscle and flesh, and it lived 135 million years ago. It may also have been significantly larger than a bear, estimated at anywhere between 15 and 23 feet tall. It was larger than any of the raptors that appear in the original Jurassic Park movies. It was also bulkier, weighing upwards of 800 pounds. What a lot of people don't realize is that the infamous Velociraptor only weighed about 83 pounds. It was like a tiny baby dinosaur, a native of Cretaceous Asia. It looked nothing like the Velociraptor portrayed in movies, and was little more than a glorified chicken. On the other hand, the Utah raptor was the real deal. It had claws shaped like sickles on its feet. Each claw was nearly a foot long, equipped with keratin sheaths covering each one just like modern eagles. It could jump, lash out with its feet, and disembowel its prey in a flash. It also had long claws on its arms and serrated teeth in its mouth, which it needed for chewing and tearing meat. The Velociraptor may be the most famous raptor of them all, but it was a pipsqueak compared to the much more terrifying Utah raptor. Hyenadon. The Hyenadon lived for an unusually long period of time. Most researchers believe they existed all the way from the Eocene to the Miocene epochs, only going extinct about 20 million years ago. This was likely because there were so many various species of the Hyenadon, just like different species of dogs. The biggest was the size of a wolf, the H. higas. The smallest was the H. microdon, only about the size of your average house cat. No matter the size or shape, Hyenadons were fierce monsters and unruly predators. They had gigantic jaws supported by multiple layers of musculature along their neck. All this muscle gave the Hyenadon, which may have looked like a mix between a hyena and a wolf, immense bite power. It would have been able to break the neck of its prey with one chomp, then use its sharp teeth to slice the carcass like a butcher. Scientists have also identified an extra-long palate within the Hyenadon's mouth, which allowed it to breathe normally at the same time that it wolfed food down its throat. The Tapejara. The Tapejara was a kind of pterosaur that lived during the Cretaceous period. Its remains were found in Brazil and dated back to roughly 100 million years ago. All things considered, it was a fairly small pterosaur with a measly wingspan of roughly 4.3 feet. On the other hand, it may have been preposterously large. The issue here is that very few fossils have been found, and researchers have never been able to agree on its size, feeding habits, or general appearance. Some experts claim its wingspan was up to 12 feet long, but its bones were so light it only weighed roughly 80 pounds. This means it would have been a terrifyingly large predator, something just as fearsome as an eagle, but way bigger. It also may have looked a lot more like a pelican than an eagle. Some scientists believe it had a downward curving beak that acted as a soup spoon to scoop fish from the water. But yet again, not all paleontologists agree on the soup spoon theory. Some have suggested its curved beak was used to peck fruit from the trees. And yet again, some paleontologists say the Tapejara wasn't a predator or a fruit eater, but a savage carnivore that scavenged animal corpses. The one thing that's for certain and that everyone agrees on is that the Tapejara had a large crest on the top of its head. The crest was likely used for attracting mates, but that's unclear. It almost looked like the Tapejara was wearing a large and colorful helmet. The Tapejara may also have been covered in fuzz, making it look like a grotesquely large bat with a pelican mouth and a red fleshy lump on its skull. Carbonemis. The Carbonemis was a strange and mysterious prehistoric creature. If we were to stumble upon this prehistoric beast now, it would definitely be a scary thing to behold. That's because the Carbonemis was a gigantic turtle. It stood at least as tall as an average person's hips, and its shell is estimated to have been nearly 7 feet long. It lived in Colombia, with its fossils being found in the famous Cerrejón Formation. Technically, the Carbonemis belong to a family of side-necked turtles called Pleurodira. These turtles are unique in that they have proportionately longer necks than most other species. Their necks are so long that they are unable to pull them back into their shell when they sense danger. Instead of tucking their necks into their shells, they bend them at an awkward angle to fit underneath the ridge of their upper shell, and then they lay against them. They basically lay on their own necks to stop predators from biting them off. Still, the Carbonemis wouldn't have had too big of an issue with predators. It lived roughly 59 million years ago in South America, a time when the jungle was ruled by behemoths. The only thing that may have even attempted to eat the Carbonemis was the Titanoboa, a 40-foot snake so big it wouldn't be able to fit through most doorways. Meganorpsis permiana. The Meganorpsis permiana, or Meganura for short, is believed to have been one of the largest insects that ever lived on the prehistoric planet. It was an ancient dragonfly that evolved 275 million years ago in the late Permian era. Its wingspan was roughly 2.5 feet, and it weighed about 1 pound. That doesn't sound like very much, especially not for a creature with the title of biggest. However, do you know what else has a wingspan of 2.5 feet and weighs roughly 1 pound? There was once a dragonfly the same size as a crow. This gigantic dragonfly was found fossilized in France in 1880. Another one was found in England in 1979. These creatures appear to have lived in Europe and were fierce predators. Because the Meganura was so big, it had its pick of prey. Its diet consisted primarily of other insects, which it feasted on mercilessly. As for why the Meganura grew to be so big, there are a few theories. It did live during the Carboniferous, when a lot of other insects were quite large, but its particular gigantism may have been due to the lack of aerial vertebrate predators. There weren't birds, and there were no other flying creatures to prey on the Meganura. This allowed it to grow gigantic and become king of the insects. Andrewosaurus. The Andrewosaurus was first described in 1924 based on a single piece of skull. All these years later, we still don't have any other fossils of this prehistoric predator. The creature has been described frequently throughout the years, said to have been a quadrupedal meat-eater built like a gigantic cat or a prehistoric bear. However, it's impossible to truly understand what the monster looked like, since we only have the top half of its skull. No other bones have been found, and so most of what we know is speculation and educated guessing. Still, the popular theory is that the Andrewosaurus was kind of like a wolf, only it lived 43 million years ago in the early Miocene period. Some have estimated it may have been the largest meat-eating mammal that ever lived on the planet. But again, this is all based on the skull, and the skeleton size is extrapolated from the skull. Without seeing how its muscles attach to its skeleton, it's really difficult to gauge just how powerful the Andrewosaurus was. As an example of what I'm talking about, the dire wolf is almost identical skeletally to the modern gray wolf. However, because scientists have studied full skeletons of the dire wolf, we know it had a much larger muscle mass. Its muscle attachment points were more developed than an ordinary wolf, and that larger muscle mass made it a bigger and more fearsome creature. The only thing that's for certain is that the Andrewosaurus was a major predator. It only lived for about 2 million years and then went extinct at around the same time the Himalayan mountains were forming. The frozen dragon. A new kind of flying reptile was discovered in the icy wastelands of Alberta, Canada in 2019. Paleontologists have called it a frozen dragon, an entirely new genus of pterosaur that lived alongside dinosaurs 76 million years ago. However, it didn't really live alongside them so much as it lived above them in the skies. This creature had a wingspan of at least 16 feet, but could have grown as large as 33 feet. It lived in Western Canada and looked very much like our modern idea of what a dragon should look like. According to Mike Habib from the University of Southern California, the gigantic reptile lived at a time when the landscape of Canada was temperate. It was far warmer than Alberta is today and hosted a whole ecosystem of unique dinosaurs and early animals. And soaring above them in the clouds was the frozen dragon. The bones of this mysterious pterosaur were technically discovered 3 decades ago, but it was only a few years back that researchers confirmed the creature belonged to its own genus. It was one of the very first vertebrates that took to the sky, and it's related to other pterosaurs that were even bigger. For example, the Quetzalcoatlus was another flying reptile that grew double the size of the frozen dragon. Pterosaurs as a group were the closest we have ever come on this planet to having dragons roaming around. Our ancient brains. A shocking new study has revealed some interesting information about our brains. We finally have some answers to the age-old questions. What makes modern humans unique? And what sets us apart from our primitive relatives like the Neanderthals? We know that modern humans split in development from our famous archaic ancestors between 300,000 and 80,000 years ago. But why did we survive and they didn't? Scientists with the Max Planck Institute of Molecular Cell Biology and Genetics, or MPI-CBG, learned that modern humans evolved a single amino acid which increased the number of brain cells we could create. This small change eventually led to a cognitive separation between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, and this new study is offering the very first real proof that we as Homo sapiens were indeed smarter than Neanderthals. This discovery has come as a big surprise for a few reasons. Scientists have always been confused because our brains were almost identical in size to the brains of Neanderthals. Nobody understood how we managed to be so much more intelligent if we had the same brains. To make sense of this, scientists had to look at the genes from the Neanderthal brain. When they compared the gene TK-TL1, which is involved in producing neurons, they found a very slight difference from modern human genes. In current Homo sapiens, the gene works to create neurons at a faster pace, giving us a more powerful frontal lobe. When the Neanderthal brain grew, the neurons were created too slowly to grant any superior intelligence. But when a single gene variation occurred, humans suddenly had massive cognitive ability because of an explosion of neurons. In the end, it all came down to the developmental process of the brain. Minerals on the moon. In September of 2022, a massive new discovery on the moon was announced. China has just become the 3rd country to discover a brand new lunar mineral. According to China's National Space Administration, researchers studying samples brought back from the moon by their Chang'e 5 lunar probe found an entirely new mineral. It's the 6th new mineral to be found on the moon, China's first, and it could have serious implications for the future of technology. The newly discovered mineral has been called Changasite Y and is currently being studied by a team from the Beijing Research Institute of Uranium Geology. This new mineral is a clear and colorless columnar crystal, but as of now, there is not really much to do with it. There's only a very small amount of this new material, and nobody is entirely sure what its properties could mean for science. However, finding new materials and minerals on the moon is a big deal. These minerals could wind up being as important as coal was in the Industrial Revolution one day. It's even possible that they could boost deep space exploration and help push forward potential settlements on the moon itself. Shark scales and human teeth. Researchers have just discovered fresh evidence that teeth may have evolved from the scales of sharks. This is wildly exciting because it could confirm the outside-in hypothesis, which suggests that as scales grew along an animal's body over millions of years, they gradually moved closer to the mouth of the creature. Eventually, the scales moved all the way into the animal's jaw and then became used for eating. They were such an evolutionary success that the scales transformed into teeth and became a staple for most animals we know today. A team from Penn State University may have just confirmed this hypothesis. Todd Cook and his colleagues did this by studying the tissue structure of rostral denticles, which are spikes inside the snouts of sawfish. They look like teeth, but aren't, and are used for foraging and self-defense. When the researchers looked to the fossil record, they found an example of an extinct sawfish from 100 million years ago. This revealed clear evidence that the rostral denticles started out as modified scales. What this implies is that teeth evolved as a side effect of scaly armor. Then, as animals continued to progress over time, teeth became a staple in evolution and were passed on to newly developed species, humans included. Mythical bronze creature. A mythical bronze creature has been unearthed in China at the mysterious archaeological site of Sanxingdui. The relic is enormous, weighing 330 pounds and measured at about 3 feet long. It's currently the largest and most impressive bronze animal statue found in the area. Sanxingdui was discovered in 1986 and has been linked to the vaguely understood Kingdom of Shu. They prospered in southwest China during the Bronze Age up until around 316 BC, when they vanished without a trace, never to pop up anywhere again. They left behind no written records, so not much is known about their history. All we have to go on are the thousands of relics excavated in their great city. Most of the artifacts found here are of weird animals, alien-like humanoids, and mythical beasts. They seem to have been a culture obsessed with myths and legends, as well as creating bizarre monsters. However, out of the 14,000 relics uncovered since the first excavation in '86, the giant bronze beast is the first of its kind. It was found in a sacrificial pit, and nobody is really sure what it is. The creature has a tree engraved on its chest, a single horn on its head, and doesn't look like anything alive today. Archaeologists still have no clue what the creepy bronze animal was ever supposed to be. Attack of the Megalodon. 2 fossilized vertebrae from the same prehistoric whale were discovered along Calvert Cliffs in Chesapeake Bay. The fossils date back 15 million years from the Miocene period. According to the researchers at the Calvert Marine Museum, the fossils belong to a rather small whale that was only about 13 feet long. However, what's both interesting and tragic is that the pair of fossils show that the animal was brutally injured, and scientists believe the attacker was most likely a megalodon. The whale had its bones crushed by the intense force of the megalodon's bite, then went on living in great pain for 2 more months before it finally succumbed to its injuries. This is a spectacular discovery because it shows the physical remains of a megalodon attack victim. We have plenty of megalodon teeth, so many that kids frequently pull them out of rivers and find them on the beach. But to find the skeleton of an animal that had its bones crushed by the biggest shark that ever lived is extraordinarily rare. Researchers at the museum say the backbones of the whale were bent with such force that the pressure smashed their neighboring vertebra. It would have been a horrible injury for the whale, and it goes to demonstrate the unstoppable power of the megalodon. Kleinfelter Syndrome. The oldest case of Kleinfelter Syndrome has officially been identified in a 1,000-year-old Portuguese skeleton. The person who it once belonged to had suffered from a serious and rare condition that gives men an extra X chromosome. The primary effect of the syndrome is infertility, with very little production capabilities in the male reproductive organ. The syndrome also gives the victim extraordinarily small and dysfunctional testes. It occurs in every 1,000 genetic male births and also has the unfortunate side effect of impacting motor skills and mental development. The syndrome was only diagnosed recently in 1942, and scientists don't know exactly what causes it. The only factor that seems to play a big role is if the baby is born from a mother over the age of 40. The condition is incurable, and it shortens the average lifespan of the victim by roughly 2.1 years. Today, only about 0.1% of the population has a chance of being born with the syndrome. However, 1,000 years ago in northeastern Portugal,
in a small town with few people, one man developed Kleinfelter Syndrome. Out of the 59 graves that were excavated at the Torre Velha necropolis, there was only one individual that suffered from this rare disorder. His skull showed significantly larger than normal teeth. He had a horrible gum condition that had ravaged the soft tissue of his mouth, and he was buried rather poorly. He was found in a shallow tomb without a cover and with no burial goods. Researchers don't know if this guy was an outcast in society or if his unusual condition ostracized him from the rest of civilization, but the way he was buried is pretty telling. They also aren't sure why he developed this syndrome or how far back in history it goes. Ant raft. If you're not sure what an ant raft is, it's a really bizarre phenomenon in nature. Whenever there's a storm and the ants' nest floods, they form huge floating blobs to stay alive on the surface of the water. In a new study, scientists tried to figure out the mechanics of these incredible biological lifeboats. This study was done by engineers at the University of Colorado Boulder. According to the primary investigator, Frank Verneri, single ants are not as intelligent as people think they are. It's only when they work as a collective that they become frighteningly intelligent, putting together the brainpower of the entire community. They conducted their experiment by dropping thousands of fire ants into a bucket of water and then watched for 8 hours to see the evolution of the raft. Scientists were shocked to discover that the ants worked in harmony to construct a living boat. They found out that these ant rafts are made up of 2 layers. The bottom layer is a solid base of ants clinging to one another, creating a structurally sound platform. The second layer is made up of ants walking around on top of the platform like people walking on a ship's deck. Then, every so often, the ants on top would switch with the ants on the bottom to keep the whole thing going. Surprisingly, the engineers determined that it only takes a total of 10 ants to form one of these rafts. The ants are forced together using a fluid phenomenon known as the Cheerios effect. And when that force becomes too strong, they cling together and become buoyant enough to float on top of the water. Ancient Maya settlement. In late summer of 2022, archaeologists uncovered an ancient Maya settlement in central Belize. The settlement dates back 1,000 years and was identified in an old Mennonite farming community. Sadly, almost nothing is left of the settlement except white mounds of dust from where buildings once stood. About 300 years before the collapse of the Maya in 600 AD, this site was mysteriously abandoned. People had lived here for roughly 350 years, then packed up and left for unknown reasons. The archaeological evidence found here is scant at best. There are no pyramids, no plazas, and no temples that were used in human sacrifices. Instead, we see the sunken plaster foundations of houses that would have been inhabited by ordinary people. Researchers haven't found much more than vessels used for holding food and cooking supplies. This was an agricultural community, and they used the local landscape for growing crops and breeding animals. This unnamed settlement was what the real Maya civilization looked like outside the major population centers. Cities like Chichen Itza were huge and incredible, with advanced architecture and tens of thousands of people. But that was the big city. However, the real backbone of Maya society lived out in the jungle on small plots of farmland, just like this one. One very old tooth. Archaeologists in the country of Georgia have discovered a tooth that's roughly 1.8 million years old. The implications of this tooth are astounding. It belonged to an early species of human that may have lived in one of the first prehistoric human settlements outside Africa. The tooth was found near the rural village of Orozmani, about 60 miles from the capital of Tbilisi. It's the same place where human skulls dating back to around the same time were found in the 1990s. This is currently the oldest tooth ever found outside of Africa, proving that when humans migrated off the continent, they went straight to the South Caucasus. To really drive the point home on just how important this discovery is, we need to understand that the oldest human fossils come from Ethiopia and are 2.8 million years old. Scientists have also uncovered the remnants of tools dated roughly 2.1 million years old in China. However, The only truly ancient human remains outside Africa have been found in Georgia, making it a cradle of prehistoric human life. Georgia marks the beginning of humanity's domination of the planet.
Amorites in ancient Israel. From about 2000 BC until 1600 BC, the Amorites ruled a large part of Mesopotamia. They were the rulers of what is now Syria and Palestine, likely originating from Arabia many centuries before. The details are a little blurry going so far back, but it's believed the Amorites started as a tribe of nomads who brought down the dynasty around 2004 BC, and then they built their own kingdom. In the Bible, the Amorites are mentioned as the people of Canaan. The Bible also describes them as giants, people of immense stature like cedar trees. And in Deuteronomy, the last book of the Torah, the Amorite king Og is said to be the last of the legendary giants. But the scary part about the Amorites is that they supposedly sacrificed their children to their false gods. Both sons and daughters were slaughtered in the name of false idols. Evidence of this was discovered in 1902 by archaeologist Stuart McAllister at the site of Gezer. He uncovered an ancient altar used by the people of Canaan to worship their gods. And here, he discovered what appeared to be evidence of child sacrifice in the form of infant skeletons. This seems to confirm what the Bible says about the Amorites. They did worship strange gods, and they very well may have sacrificed their own children to appease their thirst for blood. Japan's Calamity stones. All along Japan's coastline are some terrifying ancient stones. These stones are 300 years old and suggest a great catastrophe had once taken place in the coastal settlements of the land of the rising sun. One of these stones can be found at the edge of Anayoshi, a small Japanese village to the north. Beyond the traditional houses and other buildings is a 10-foot stone tablet standing in the jungle, carved with a grave and unsettling warning. It says, "Remember the calamity of the great tsunamis." It then urges people not to build any homes below the point of the stone, or else they could be swept away in the next storm. These kinds of artifacts have been found all along the coast. Some are as recent as 1896, while others go back much further. Some have been destroyed by earthquakes. Some are being reclaimed by nature, but all of them are terrifying. They act as a warning across every generation not to build too close to the shoreline. But not everyone has listened. According to Itoko Kitahara, a history expert on natural disasters from the Ritsu Meikon University in Kyoto, not everyone heeded the warnings. Many coastal communities ignored the advice and spread to lower ground beneath the tsunami stones. In 2011, many faced the consequences of ignorance when 29,000 people died following a deadly earthquake. These stones are all along the shore to keep people safe, but not everyone wants to take the advice of an ancient rock. Egyptian mummies. Something utterly horrifying happened in Egypt 4,000 years ago. Dozens of men were slaughtered and thrown in a tomb by some desert cliffs near Luxor. It was a mass burial of people who suffered gruesome wounds, something extremely out of place in ancient Egypt. The Egyptians weren't keen on mass burials and preferred to give everyone their own private place to rest. Yet somewhere around 2150 BC in Egypt's Old Kingdom, dozens of men were thrown into a death pit and left to mummify together. It's called the Tomb of the Warriors, located in Deir el-Bahari. It was originally discovered in 1923 and then sealed to keep the disturbing mystery sleeping. It was only recently that archaeologist Salima Ikram with the American University in Cairo opened the tomb once again. She investigated the bodies and has come to a rough conclusion on what happened all those years ago. Salima believes the mass grave contains the victims of civil unrest. Approximately 4,200 years ago, a bloody battle was sparked between regional governors during a particularly dark time in Egyptian history. One of the conflicts of this battle ended the lives of 60 men. There was so much blood and gore and so much death that the men were dumped into a pit rather than properly buried. And there, alone in the dark, they all turned into natural mummies. And now, to lighten the mood a little bit, it's shout-out time! I want to say a big thank you to Rose Nelson and David Clark for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos about incredible history. The blood of Louis XVI. In Paris in 1793, King Louis XVI of France lost his head. It happened in full view of all the people who had shown up to watch the spectacle. In typical 18th century fashion, those on the scene when King Louis was beheaded rushed to his body and dipped their handkerchiefs in the king's blood. Many years later, one of these morbid souvenirs was discovered by an Italian family. This family had been in possession of a hollow gourd for over a century. The gourd was inscribed with a rather peculiar phrase. On January 21st, Maximilien Bardelot dipped his handkerchief in the blood of Louis XVI after his decapitation. The gourd was also decorated in scenes from the French Revolution. Inside it was one of the blood-soaked handkerchiefs from that fateful day. In 2009, the family sent the handkerchief with Carles Laloueza-Fox, an expert in paleogenomics who specializes in ancient DNA. This was a huge order because finding blood from a dead French king is not the easiest thing to do. Of course, there is the mummified heart of Louis XVI's son, but that wasn't about to be swabbed for DNA. Carles had to use the mummified head from Henry IV, who died in 1610. His head was stolen from his grave during the Revolution and then found in the early 1900s at an auction. It was a ghoulish ordeal, and in the end, the blood was not verified as belonging to the king. Researchers believe it was the product of a swindler in the 18th century who sold a random bloody handkerchief. The Zombies of Yorkshire. In 2017, archaeologists announced a shocking discovery. They found knife marks on approximately 137 human bones excavated from the tiny Yorkshire village of Warham Percy in England. The bones were originally found in the 1960s, but only recently were the knife marks identified. At first, researchers weren't sure what they were dealing with. It almost looked like a case of medieval cannibalism, but instead, it looks as though the knife marks had something to do with a fear of zombies. The skeletons date from between the 11th and 14th centuries. This was right before the rise of vampire paranoia in much of Europe. What researchers believe is that the villagers mutilated the bodies of the dead so that they wouldn't rise from their graves. The corpses were dismembered, their bones were mixed up, and the pieces were reburied. This was so that after death, they couldn't put themselves back together again and terrorize the living. The Great Pit of Death. Sir Charles Leonard Woolley excavated the ancient Mesopotamian city of Ur from between 1922 and 1934. Among his discoveries were many tomb chambers without names on them. Any tomb that he could not identify was named a death pit. The most grotesque of these death pits was officially titled PG 1237, but it was dubbed by Woolley as the Great Death Pit. It got its nickname due to the sheer number of bodies that were inside the tomb. It wasn't a messy pit of death like you might imagine, but rather neatly organized. The bodies were placed in rows and dressed in rich garments. The dead people within the pit of death may have been unwilling sacrifices, people slaughtered to join their master or mistress in the afterlife. The thing about the death pits is that each one was found adjacent to a tomb of someone very important. Most of their names have been lost to history, but Woolley theorized they were nobles, important people in government, high priests, and relations to royalty. Some may even have been royalty. When one of these important people died, they had a large number of their servants killed and then buried next to them in a separate tomb. That way they could serve their masters, even in the afterlife. The big difference with the Great Death Pit is that there were a lot of remains. Whoever died and had these people slaughtered to join them must have been very important. There were 74 people inside, only 6 men and the rest were women. This suggests it was a man who was responsible, a man hoping to enter the afterlife with 68 female servants. Or perhaps concubines. The Wickerman. The Wickerman was supposedly used by the old Druids of Europe over 2,000 years ago. According to what Julius Caesar wrote in his commentary of the Gallic War, the Gauls also participated in the terrifying ritual of the Wickerman. Julius Caesar wrote it, and modern historians have confirmed it. The Gauls were extremely superstitious and had many ritual ceremonies. They supposedly hired the Druids to perform mass sacrifices to entertain their immortal gods. This was before Christianity, in the days when Rome itself was still a hub for pagan activities. but even the Romans didn't go so far as using the Wickerman. The Wickerman was a gigantic effigy of a man made of wicker. Picture a massive scarecrow almost 30 feet tall, but hollow. It was spacious, with enough room to cram human beings into its arms, legs, and torso. Dozens of people could supposedly be thrown into the wicker trap, then sealed inside. It would then be burned, and all the people stuck inside the Wickerman's body would roast alive. It was horrendous and brutal, and it may have really happened. Julius Caesar, as unreliable as his own account may be, could have been right. Modern archaeologists have found evidence of human sacrifice in Iron Age Europe. Men have been found sacrificed in bogs throughout the countryside, such as in Denmark. The only thing is that nobody's ever found evidence of a wicker man. We see it mentioned all throughout history, but the physical remains have never been found. Then again, it would be almost impossible to find such evidence, considering everything would have been burned thousands of years ago. Stone Age victims. Archaeologists poking through a Neolithic settlement in western Slovakia recently discovered a horrifying mass grave. There were about 36 bodies inside. But what makes this grave so disturbing was that none of the remains had their heads. They appeared to be the victims of some kind of cultic ceremony, something that has been baffling researchers. The discovery was made at a site in Vrable, believed to be one of the largest Stone Age settlements in Central Europe ever excavated. It's a massive site of over 50 hectares. People lived here between 5250 and 4950 BC. And while lots of interesting things have been found, the discovery of the headless corpses has definitely been the strangest. Other than the bodies, researchers have found over 300 longhouses, a fortification that was built around the settlement before it was abandoned, and a defensive ditch to protect themselves against enemies. It appears that the people here were stable and peaceful up until near the end, when they suddenly needed protection against other tribes. It was excavations in 2022 that revealed the mass grave. 35 individuals who were the victims of cult sacrifice were buried here. They weren't buried very nicely either, with the skeletons found haphazardly as if they had been dumped into the pit without care. There were men, women, and children, but nobody has found where their heads went. The heads were definitely taken from the bodies, but scientists are clueless as to what the Stone Age people did with them afterward. For that matter, no one knows what the point of such a barbaric ritual may have been. Prehistoric herpes. The disturbing prehistoric roots of the cold sore virus have been traced thanks to ancient DNA. As of right now, about 3.7 billion people across the world suffer from the herpes virus, which causes sores to grow on a person's lip. For the first time in history, the ancient genome of that very virus has been sequenced by a team of scientists from the University of Cambridge. One of the samples used in their research came from a young adult male dug out of a medieval graveyard. The individual died in the late 14th century. He suffered a grotesque dental abscess and experienced cold sores. By looking through the ancient DNA, researchers learned that the modern HSV1 strain began about 5,000 years ago. That was around the same time that Bronze Age migrations into Europe from the vast grasslands of Eurasia began. Nobody knows exactly what happened, but the people coming from the grasslands mixing with the Europeans, along with a population boom, caused kissing sores to spread like wildfire. Death of the donkey. In southern Israel, archaeologists discovered the bones of a donkey. It wasn't the most terrifying discovery, but it's still a little creepy to see the bones of a donkey from 3,500 years ago. The skeleton still had a copper bit in its mouth and saddlebags slung over its back. Researchers believe the animal was well liked in its community, and it was likely sacrificed as part of a mysterious ritual in the Bronze Age. Donkeys were extremely valuable animals in ancient Israel. It was thanks to the donkey that caravans were able to create trading networks as far back as the 18th century BC. Small, insulated kingdoms were able to trade their wares a great distance because of donkeys. The pack animals were like the U-Hauls of the Bronze Age. This particular donkey did not participate in any trading. Researchers from Israel's University of Haifa say it didn't do a day of hard labor in its life. There was no evidence that the donkey was driven or ridden for any long period of time. It was only about 4 years old and had likely been somebody's pet or a local resident of the temple where it was found. Researchers believe the donkey was brought up with great respect, then humanely killed as part of a sacrifice to appease the gods. The Antarctic King. Paleontologists uncovered the fossilized remains of a reptilian monster in Antarctica. Although the continent may be covered in ice today, virtually uninhabitable and as inhospitable as it gets, that wasn't always the case. 250 million years ago, Antarctica was covered in lush forests. It had flowing rivers and was absolutely crawling with bizarre life forms. Temperatures almost never fell below freezing, and most of the year Antarctica was as warm as any jungle today. It was during that warm period that the Antarctanax Shackletoni roamed the land, feasting on gigantic insects and other creatures. Scientists have nicknamed the monster the Antarctic King. And although it was indeed a reptilian beast, it wasn't very large. It was only about the size of an iguana, yet it was an early relative of both dinosaurs and crocodiles. Scientists were able to determine a lot from the single fossil excavated from the ice. They know it was a carnivore, it likely hunted bugs, and may have also eaten early mammal relatives. But that's not the strangest part. According to Brandon P. Cook from the Field Museum, the more we learn about prehistoric Antarctica, the weirder things get. The discovery of this reptile has shown just how extraordinary life in Antarctica used to be. About 2 million years before the Antarctic King evolved, there was a huge extinction event that killed about 90% of life on Earth. Yet for some reason, species that died out across the rest of the globe remained alive in Antarctica. Researchers aren't entirely sure why, but Antarctica appears to have been a safe haven for creatures following the extinction event. Child warrior mummy. In the Siberian Arctic, researchers uncovered the mysterious grave of a mummified child warrior. The young boy was between 6 and 7 years old when they perished. They were buried in a bundle of reindeer hide and fur, protected by a small bronze axe, perfectly sculpted to be wielded by a child. He was also buried with a special pendant crafted in the shape of a wild bear. This shocking discovery was made at the mysterious and little-known Zeleny Yar necropolis. Scientists have found other burials here, but this is the first one belonging to a child. The deceased was cocooned within a wrapping of birch bark and copper, which accidentally helped to create a mummy. Because of the freezing conditions, the permafrost, and the extraordinary wrapping job, the child was better preserved than most Egyptian mummies. Researchers also believed whoever the youngster was, they were likely part of the higher echelon of society. Unfortunately, we still don't have a clear picture of what's going on with this mystery child. Archaeologist Natalia Fyodorova says the team is hoping to reveal more details soon. All we really know is that the child belonged to an ancient tribe that lived in the frigid wastelands of Siberia about 800 years ago. But because of the axe, the young boy may have been training to be a fierce warrior. The glowing snailfish. Scientists recently discovered one of the most bizarre species of fish ever, underneath an iceberg in Greenland. They drilled through the iceberg off the coast of Greenland only to encounter a glowing green snailfish. The reason the snailfish was glowing green was that it had antifreeze coursing through its veins. That's the same stuff you put in your car to stop your engine from freezing in the winter. Researchers were positively thrilled to encounter such a strange animal. They soon learned the fish is a species called Leparis gibbus, and that it contains the highest levels of antifreeze proteins ever seen in a fish. And yes, it works almost identically to the way a car uses it. The fish seems to have evolved specialized systems to push antifreeze through its veins, preventing it from freezing to death in the polar winters. The way it works is that antifreeze proteins get stuck to tiny ice crystals and prevent them from growing. David Gruber, a biology professor, says fish around the North Pole and the South Pole have independently evolved these antifreeze proteins to survive in their harsh environments. Sadly, scientists are unsure how this unique evolutionary feature will affect the snailfish as sea temperatures get warmer. As the Arctic warms, the fish will have less use for its unique biology and could go extinct as a result. Either that, or it will evolve yet again to adapt to the new conditions. Melting Base Camp. Everest Base Camp is currently in the process of melting. In late 2022, the thawing of the Khumbu Glacier became such a problem that Nepal was forced to make plans to pack up and move the base camp. Scott Watson, an expert on glaciers from the University of Leeds, says climate change is responsible for increased rockfalls, meltwater movement on the surface of the glaciers, and the total destabilization of one of the most famous mountain camps in the world. Even if you don't want to climb Mount Everest, you can climb to the base camp to gaze up at the mightiest mountain on the planet. But as of 2022, that all changed. Researchers found the ice too unstable to allow climbers to stay any longer. Cracks appeared overnight, avalanches happened unexpectedly, and so the base must be moved 1,200 feet lower, to a spot where there is no year-round ice. But climate change isn't the only thing responsible for the movement of base camp. Yes, the ice is melting and soon the Khumbu Glacier will be gone. But there are other problems as well, such as urine. It was found that there are so many visitors to base camp every day that about 4,000 liters of urine ends up flowing down the mountain. There are also issues higher up on the mountain. Ice that took many hundreds of years to accumulate is gone. The climb has become more dangerous. The melting ice has also revealed dozens of frozen dead bodies and enough garbage to make a garbage dump. I wanted to say a big thank you to Mama Lisa 104 and Ludmila Machado for supporting this channel. If you are new here, be sure to hit that subscribe button for more videos about amazing discoveries. Colonizing Mars. Scientists have made a shocking ice discovery on another planet. The recent discovery of accessible ice sheets on Mars could help future colonization of the Red Planet. Researchers working with NASA were looking through images taken by the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter when they found ice sheets exposed on the Martian surface. These sheets appear to be pure and easy to access. It's a big deal because if there are huge chunks of ice sticking out from the surface, that would mean early colonizers to Mars would have fresh and almost limitless drinking water. NASA has known about subsurface ice on Mars for a long time. We know there are huge ice deposits on its poles, left over from when Mars was likely covered in great oceans like the ones we have on Earth. But these newly discovered ice sheets are much different. They seem to be scattered across the Martian surface and even sticking out of mountain slopes 300 feet above ground. Just imagine gigantic ice cubes that could be extracted and melted for healthy, natural, non-polluted drinking water. Shane Byrne, a planetary scientist from the University of Arizona, says the discovery of ice could be a game changer for Martian colonization and exploration. Trendy Sandals. A pair of trendy sandals from the Roman era were recently found on an ice pass in Norway. A group of Norwegian archaeologists were searching the melting glaciers and thinning ice patches in the rural mountains of the country when they came across the pair of sandals. They were buried deep in the snow, hidden at the bottom of what was once a dangerous mountain route. The discovery happened in the Jotunheim Mountains, 200 miles from Oslo. The mountain pass was commonly used by the Vikings between the years 300 and 1500 AD. This was long before any paved roads were constructed in Norway. Viking merchants and other medieval travelers moved through the mountain pass to get from one side of the country to the other. And this was no easy trip. Some parts of the pass are 6,600 feet above sea level. During their travels, many vendors and wayward wanderers lost personal objects. For example, a pair of shoes. Their objects were then covered in snow and encased within the ice. But starting in 2011, the ice patches started to melt, and ever since, archaeologists have been finding treasure. These sandals have proven particularly interesting because they were not at all designed for the cold. After all, you wouldn't wear a pair of flip-flops to hike through the snowy mountains of Norway. These sandals were designed with holes and gaps all over them, and would have been more appropriately worn in the south of Italy. Nonetheless, they were found in the Finnish mountains, buried in the snow. Researchers aren't sure what happened. These sandals may have come from an explorer who realized he wasn't going to need the footwear where he was going, and simply tossed them out. Mysterious fungi. A rather unusual discovery was made in the Scottish Highlands. Researchers were examining soil samples in search of fungi. A team of volunteers hiked through the Cairngorms National Park in 2021 and collected samples from high up in the snowy mountains. They found multiple species of fungi totally new to the UK, along with one particularly mysterious fungus not known to science. You might not think so, but the mountains in Scotland are responsible for storing an estimated 1/3 of the land carbon on the planet. This is due to their regenerative peat bogs. The whole area is a blanket of moss and peat and fungi, but not much of this fungi has been studied because the highlands are remote, cold, and everything is covered in ice and snow. So what's the big deal about fungi anyway? Ecologist Andrea Britton says fungi are important for the functioning of alpine ecosystems. But we know almost nothing about the diversity of it because so much of it is hidden underground or frozen under permafrost. During this most recent study, scientists identified fungi from the Arctic and from Antarctica. They also uncovered a rare violet coral fungus that's critical to grassland ecosystems. The Octavius. In 1761, the Octavius was docked in London, England. It was loaded up with cargo and sailed for China. When the ship took off, it had a full crew and everything seemed to be up to code. The Octavius was in good shape, the men were in good spirits, and they made it to China without incident. But then something strange happened. It was on its way back to British shores when the captain got a really bad idea. He decided he would push the ship through the Northwest Passage to get home sooner, even though that meant potentially getting stuck in the ice. The Octavius never made it back to Britain. It wasn't seen again until October 11, 1775. A whaling ship by the name of Herald spotted the Octavius off the coast of Greenland. The captain and the crew boarded the ship to see what they could find, but it appeared deserted. It wasn't until they broke into the darkness of the ship's hull that they found the 28 crew members frozen solid in blocks of ice. They then found the captain seated at his desk, his pen frozen in his hand, and the ship's logbook frozen on the desk before him. We still don't know exactly what happened, but by putting the clues together, experts are fairly sure of the events that transpired after the Octavia left China. The ship went through the Northwest Passage, got stuck in the ice, and everyone on board turned into human icicles. Based on the way they were discovered, the crew of the Octavius were hit by a sudden plunge in temperature that caused them to freeze solid in a very short time. Sunken truck. An international team of scientists recently put their expertise together to recover a very unusual object from the frigid Arctic waters. They used specialized divers, airbags, and a helicopter to retrieve a submerged Ford 150 truck that fell through the ice in early 2022. It happened near the Tasmania Islands in the Canadian territory of Nunavut, which is one of the most isolated places in the world you can visit. Divers traveled all the way to the frigid north from Iceland. They dove underneath the ice, then attached airbags to the truck and towed it to shore. They then attached the F-150 to a helicopter and airlifted it to Joa Haven. Team member Andrew Picard called the recovery a tremendous success. But why did so many people go through so much trouble to pull up a pickup truck out of the water after it smashed through the ice? The vehicle was originally part of something called the Trans-Global Car Expedition. A team of 16 people from various countries completed a massive journey overland from Yellowknife to Resolute across the Canadian territories. The whole journey was about 1,300 miles. It was the very first overland crossing using trucks from the continental shelf of Canada all the way to the high Arctic. It was also a precursor to an even longer overland journey that will circumnavigate the globe. But during the journey, one of the trucks crashed through the ice and sank. The team members went back, not to save the vehicle, but to clean the land and not leave their garbage behind. Would you go through that much effort for a truck? Let me know in the comments. The next pandemic. The next global pandemic might just be waiting in the Arctic ice. Researchers recently sequenced segments of DNA and RNA taken from the soil in the Arctic Circle near Lake Hazen. What the scientists were hoping to do was identify potential viruses hiding beneath the ice in the Arctic soil. They used a computer algorithm to look at the viruses and potential hosts in the area, assessing spillover risk. What this means is the ability for any potential frozen viruses to be picked up by a carrier and then spread to humans. For example, spillover risk would be a virus melting out of a glacier, being picked up by a deer, and then being transferred to a person. They did not identify any immediate concerns. However, they did suggest that glacier runoff will lead to a greater chance of viruses jumping onto hosts, which thereby increases spillover risk. They learned that as the ice in the Arctic melts, it releases viruses and organic material that gets washed out into lakes and rivers. This increases the potential that an organism becomes infected and then reaches humanity. Deinosuchus. Between 83 and 72 million years ago, the Deinosuchus was the largest predator in North America. This isn't an exaggeration either. It was the undisputed top predator of its day, roughly twice as heavy as the biggest tyrannosaur that ever lived. The Deinosuchus was a terrifying prehistoric alligator. The largest Deinosuchus was an estimated 35 feet long, with a maximum weight of nearly 8 tons. It looked almost identical to modern alligators, but it was significantly bigger. It ruled the Cretaceous period at a time when North America was divided into small continental islands. North America was almost like a giant swamp, with large pieces of land spread throughout. The Deinosuchus was perfectly adapted to the watery environment, and so it easily became the apex predator. One of the interesting things about the growth of this prehistoric reptile is that the older it got, the bigger it grew. Scientists examined growth rings in the bony plates of fossils and found they grew kind of like trees. Unlike dinosaurs that matured quickly and then stopped growing, the Deinosuchus got bigger the longer it lived. With a lifespan of at least 50 years, these ancient alligators could grow to be truly monstrous beasts. The Deinosuchus was really just a gigantic alligator. It had the same physical features, except bigger. It also grew for a lot longer than ordinary alligators today. However, it was almost certainly the Deinosuchus's preposterous size that caused it to go extinct when the asteroid killed the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. The smaller species of alligator survived because they didn't need to eat so much in a world of extinct animals. Dunkleosteus. The Dunkleosteus lived a very, very long time ago. It first appears in the historical record in the late Devonian, 380 million years ago. It likely only lived for about 20 million years before evolution replaced it with something new. But during those 20 million years, it was a truly fearsome monster of the deep. The Dunkleosteus was kind of like an armored fish that could grow 30 feet long and weigh as much as 4 tons. It was an unstoppable killing machine. It was absurdly large and wore thick armor plating that would make a medieval knight jealous, but it had no teeth. The greatest thing about the Dunkleosteus is that scientists have discovered a lot of their fossils. We know pretty much everything there is to know about these prehistoric fish, which were likely the largest vertebrates of their time. Scientists have compared the Dunkleosteus to a living underwater tank. It had a bulging head, huge toothless jaws jutting out from its thick body, and it swam very slowly. Because it wore such heavy armor, it could hardly move through the water. This proved to be a huge issue with hunting because the armored fish couldn't chase down its prey. Scientists believe things would get so bad for these slow-moving fish that they would sometimes resort to cannibalism. The most impressive feature of the fish was its bite. Scientists have estimated that the Dunkleosteus boasted a bite force of roughly 8,000 pounds per square inch. That makes this fish's bite just as powerful as the T-Rex or the Megalodon, Ornithomimosaur. Paleontologists working in Mississippi recently identified what they believe could be the fastest dinosaur that ever lived. It's called the Ornithomimosaur, and it's a kind of bipedal dinosaur that looked kind of like an ostrich, but wasn't a bird. Tom Cullen, one of the scientists involved in the discovery of the creature in Mississippi's Utah Formation, described it like this. He says the dinosaur had super big eyes, really long arms, strangely large hands with claws on the ends of their fingers, and absolutely no teeth. Instead, this dinosaur had a beak made from keratin that it used for crushing its food into digestible mush. The Ornithomimosaur lived between 145 million and 66 million years ago across the entire northern hemisphere. The earliest specimens found in China were barely more than 26 pounds. But as time went on, these things grew and grew. The original Ornithomimosaur was about 3 feet in length, but after 50 million years of evolution, the Ornithomimosaur grew to be 33 feet long. We know this because of more recent fossils discovered in Mongolia. As for speed, no other dinosaur can really compare to the ridiculous sprinting abilities of the Ornithomimosaur. Scientists believe the fastest species, the Struthiomimus, ran about as quickly as an ostrich at a dizzying 43 miles per hour. That's the exact same top speed an ostrich can reach when sprinting at full stride. It's shout-out time! I want to say a big thank you to Niala Kuro and Chun's Buns for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you are new here for more videos about prehistoric creatures. Archaeotherium. The Archaeotherium is an extinct type of cow. More specifically, it was an entelodont, a member of the Artiodactyls family that includes everything from cattle to deer and even sheep. On the floodplains of Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Texas, these prehistoric cows lived alongside other giant beasts like rhinoceroses and mastodons. They were around from between 37 and 23 million years ago, and while it wasn't exactly the most terrifying creature that ever lived, it was certainly scarier than any cows or deers that are around today. Scientists believe the Archaeotherium was no simple plant eater. It was likely an omnivore that not only chewed on roots, but crunched on bones. The most terrifying feature of the animal was by far its tusk-like canines. These things were used to dig tubers and vegetables out of the ground, while also crushing bones from prehistoric camels. The North American Pobrotherium was likely one of the main sources of food for the Archaeotherium. We know this because scientists discovered the ancient camel bones in Wyoming, with puncture marks that match the teeth from the Archaeotherium. But the mystery behind these creatures doesn't stop yet. Up until very recently, scientists called them giant pigs from hell because they resembled modern pigs but were more frightening. But in 2009, a new study revealed that all entelodonts are more closely related to whales. Even though the Archaeotherium was a deadly pig-looking monster that feasted on camels, it was more closely related to whales in the ocean. Glyptodon. The Glyptodon was a preposterously large armadillo that weighed almost 4,500 pounds. It lived throughout North America and South America from 2.5 million years ago until around 11,000 years ago. Its last home was in the jungles of South America, just as the Ice Age was coming to an end. Armadillos these days are so small you could pick one up and use it as a basketball. Not that anyone should ever do that. In comparison, the Glyptodon was about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, only twice as heavy. It even kind of looked like a beetle with its bony shell and short limbs. It was kind of like an ankylosaur from the days of the dinosaurs. To protect itself, the Glyptodon could generally hide within its own shell. It couldn't retract its head like a turtle, but it did have a massive clubbed tail to fight back with. Most of its body was fully protected by its armor, and then it could break its enemy's shins with its mace-like tail. Because the Glyptodon lived in South America at the same time as early humans, many of our ancestors likely encountered these beasts in the wild. Scientists have even discovered evidence that humans would use the shells from dead Glyptodons as portable houses. These shells were so big, people could clean them, insulate them, and use them as rent-free housing. Phorus racos. It was in 1887 that the Phorus racos longissimus was first described based on a single jaw fragment. A fragment of a skull was discovered encased in a piece of rock, then preserved only long enough for a researcher to draw a sketch of it while in the field. Since then, very few skull remains have been found. We have almost no evidence this creature even existed, except the sketch and a handful of loose bones. Nonetheless, scientists believe the Phorus racus was one of the scariest terror bird species that ever lived. Terror birds were flightless birds that lived throughout the Miocene epoch between 23 and 5 million years ago. There were a lot of different species of terror birds, but they all had one thing in common. They were nightmares on legs. Think of an ostrich or an emu, both flightless birds, but much larger and significantly more dangerous. For example, the Forest raccoon stood somewhere around 9 feet tall and weighed upwards of 290 pounds. That's roughly the size of the largest male ostrich in history. Its legs were strong. It could run at extremely fast speeds, and it had a hooked beak designed for tearing through flesh. The end of its beak was so sharp it could use it like a skewer to stab its prey. Then, with a jerking motion of its head, could rip its victim apart. And just like modern flightless birds, the Forest raccoon had 3 sharp claws on its feet for stabbing and slicing. Josepho artigacia. Josepho artigacia was one of the most terrifying rodents that ever lived. It was first described by paleontologist Ernesto Blanco in 2008. Since then, we have learned a fair amount about these creatures. According to National Geographic, the Josepho artigacia was so impressive it would make the capybara look like a measly sewer rat, and capybaras are currently the largest rodent at 130 pounds. The discovery of the creature is thanks to a single skull found in a piece of rock in Uruguay. The skull alone was nearly 2 feet long and 4 million years old. Even with only one specimen, scientists knew right away this was the biggest rodent of all time. Its skull was about the same size as the skull of a modern beef cow. What this suggests is that its body was roughly 8 feet 7 inches. It also likely weighed over 1,000 pounds. That's 10 times bigger than the capybara. The Josepho artigacia truly was a frightening monster, a rat bigger than most cows. This was a rat so big, it wouldn't even fit in a sewer. Chaoyangsaurus. The Chaoyangsaurus was a small dinosaur that lived in Asia during the Jurassic period. It thrived starting about 150 million years ago. It laid eggs, only ate plants, and looked really weird. We only have a single specimen to base all our knowledge off of, found in northeastern China in 1976. The Chaoyangsaurus was not scary or even big. It grew to a maximum length of about 3 feet, and even its bones were weak. Just about any predator would have been able to munch on this thing for a breakfast snack. The tiny dino looked exactly like any lizard alive today, except that it walked on 2 legs and may have had a frilly sail on its tail. It also belonged to the Ceratopsia family of horned-faced dinosaurs, meaning it was distantly related to the Triceratops. Camaraosaurus. The Camaraosaurus was a very real sea monster. This thing was the original kraken, significantly larger than any living cephalopod today. It was so big that when put beside the giant squid would look more like a baby squid. The Camaraosaurus is believed by many to be the largest cephalopod that ever existed. However, no one really knows how big it was in total. Because we only have fossils of its shell, we don't know what the squishy parts of its body looked like. Its shell alone was between 18 and 20 feet long, but how long its tentacles were is a mystery. It possibly could have had 8 slimy tentacles over 20 feet long, or they could have been like small nubby appendages barely sticking out from the bottom of its shell. Still, its shell alone makes the Camaraosaurus unbelievably large. The undersea creature lived during the Middle Silurian, between 443 and 416 million years ago. This was a time of wild evolutionary advancement for sea creatures. The planet had just gone through millions of years of climatic fluctuations. The climate had been extremely erratic, but the Silurian ushered in a time of climate stability. Huge glacial formations melted, sea levels rose a lot, and life in the ocean began to evolve at a rapid rate. This resulted in creatures like the Camaraosaurus being created. But what's truly impressive is that all these years later, these cephalopods alive today are almost exactly the same as the Camaraosaurus, only a little smaller. Arctodus. The Arctodus was a gigantic, short-faced bear. Not only was the Arctodus one of the largest bears that ever lived, but it was also a predatory killing machine. It went extinct about 12,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. It was wiped out with many of the other prehistoric beasts we know and love, like the mammoth and the saber-toothed tiger. There were 2 main species in North America. There was the A. pristinus, which was smaller than the A. simus. The smaller bear lived only in the eastern United States, while the giant short-faced bear lived from Canada down to Mexico. The larger version is considered to be one of the largest terrestrial mammalian carnivores that ever existed. This thing would make a grizzly bear look like a koala bear. When the bear was walking on 4 legs, it stood about 6 feet at the shoulders. It stood over 10 feet tall on its hind legs when standing up and could weigh over 2,000 pounds. It ate everything from vegetation to wandering deer. Anything that moved or looked tasty was on the menu for one of America's greatest predators. But like all the most impressive predators that went extinct at the end of the last ice age, the Arctodus was way too big. The smaller species went extinct 300,000 years ago, unable to keep up with the bigger and more clever animals. And then, more recently, the giant short-faced bear just couldn't keep up with smaller bears like black bears and brown bears. It simply ran out of food and died out. Thanks for watching! Which of these prehistoric creatures would you bring back to life if given the chance? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you soon. Bye!